Hi and welcome to Simplifying Sustainability. I'm Donal, founder and CEO of ENSO.
And I'm Erin, our sustainability expert here at ENSO.
Today we'll be talking about Scope 3 emissions. And this is a key topic for understanding your overall carbon footprint as a business.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that Scope 3 emissions can be daunting and feel really big and confusing. So today we're going to take some time to break it down, give you strategies to apply this knowledge to your business, and hopefully leave you feeling a little bit less confused.
Yeah. And by the end of this episode, you'll have a greater understanding of your own Scope 3 emissions and how your business can get started measuring and monitoring them in a really practical way. So let's get started. Erin, why are Scope 3 emissions so important?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for most businesses, Scope 3, or kind of your indirect emissions, make up the vast majority of your overall footprint. I know this sounds a little bit counterintuitive because they're your indirect emissions, and we'll go into a little bit more depth on the actual definition in a little bit. But Scope 3 encompasses things like any transport logistics, any goods or services that you're purchasing, your waste disposal, employee commuting. There are so many different aspects that go into Scope 3. And usually it actually is upwards of 90 to 95% of your overall footprint as a business, as compared to kind of that 10% of your direct Scope 1 and 2 emissions, those emissions that we talked about in our previous podcast. So because of the sheer volume of Scope 3, it makes it really, really important.
Wow. And because of that 90%, plus in some cases, this can cause a lot of overwhelm. So many businesses really are feeling overwhelmed by the idea of looking at their Scope 3 emissions because simply of how large they are. Do you have any advice?
Yeah, absolutely. It's incredibly understandable to be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of Scope 3 and the fact that they're indirect, so they're not completely under your control. Again, we'll dive into that in a little bit. But one good thing about Scope 3 is that there are actually specific categories of Scope 3 broken down in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is internationally recognized and accepted playbook essentially for how to calculate your carbon emissions as a business. It's a great standard to look at if you're starting your emissions calculation journey, and they actually give you 15 different Scope 3 categories. So you can go in there, look at the ones that are the most useful for you, and start going piece by piece, chunk by chunk, and adding them on as you feel comfortable.
Brilliant. And looking at this then from a practical element, Erin, when a business is we talk about Scope 3, it's a broad topic. Like, what can they actually look out for? What exact things comes under that Scope 3?
Yeah, so here we go with kind of the specific definition of what Scope 3 emissions are. Scope 3 emissions are your upstream, so before anything gets to your specific operation, whether that's your raw materials or your employees driving from home, whatever it might be. Your upstream and your downstream, so waste disposal, shipping your product out, the use of your product or service. So you have your upstream and downstream indirect emissions. So these are emissions from things related to your operations, but not directly, say, burned on site or purchased through electricity purchases or other energy purchases. So you're looking at emissions that can be directly attributed to kind of your operations, your product, your service, but aren't directly emitted by you or your energy use. This is part of the reason it's so tricky, and because it's not something that is directly in your control and you need to rely on information from others that you're working with, it can be really tricky to get started with Scope 3.
Got it. And a lot of products and when you're producing something, there's often a big supply chain and you're looking at multiple different suppliers and different routes and different scenarios where your materials have come from. So I can see how that can be tricky. You mentioned then some categories of Scope 3. Can you talk about what these are?
Yeah, so I mentioned the Greenhouse Gas Protocol briefly just before our last question. And this is the international protocol and guidebook for calculating your Scope 3 emissions and your Scope 1 and 2 emissions as well. Actually, it's really the go-to direction manual in a way of calculating your emissions. But within this protocol, there are 15 different categories of emissions, from purchase goods and services to transport and logistics, all the way to your finances and investments. So going and diving into these 15 categories is a great place to start when trying to break down this big idea of scope 3. In reality, it's actually 15 different puzzle pieces that fit together to give you the full picture rather than just one huge thing to look at. And all 15 of those might not be relevant to you, but the ones that are, you'll have some great guidance there in the greenhouse gas protocol on how to get started.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I know in ENSO on our platform, when we're looking at that scope 1 and 2, we use that greenhouse gas protocol to get that emission factors for your energy use and your gas. But when a business is looking at the scope 3, can you explain a little bit more about how they might be able to use the greenhouse gas protocol when looking at the scope 3 in a practical way?
So the greenhouse gas protocol, it's not going to have the exact data you need. It's not going to have the exact numbers. It's not going to have the emission factor for purchasing, say, a laptop, and if you buy that many in a year, multiply it by this number. It's not going to have that specifically. What it will have is formulas and processes that then you can take and apply to your own emissions calculations. So it is a little bit like when you're in primary school maths and you're learning the equations, and then you take a word problem and take that information and plug it into these equations and into these processes to solve them. If you think of your company kind of as like the word problem, you have the context, you have the different aspects you're trying to solve for. The greenhouse gas protocol is giving you the steps to get to that answer. They do have specific examples that are fully worked through that you can see how they've done it, but you will need to take what you learn there, apply it directly to your business, and go from there.
Great. I suppose one of the big benefits there is that it's giving like a level playing field. So if people are using, and businesses are using this standard and this, equation, as you put it, at least everyone's, producing the same numbers and we can compare apples with apples.
I mean, absolutely. So one of the biggest things when you are calculating your emissions, particularly scope 3, because it can be tricky due to that indirect nature, right? So this is not, I'm looking at my electricity bill, I know the kilowatt hours, I went on the website for my energy provider, they've actually calculated an emissions factor based on their energy mix here in Ireland. I did that multiplication. We're pretty confident in the accuracy of that, right? Because it is direct. This is indirect. Yeah. This is, you're going to be reaching out to your partner who supplies the packaging for your product. They're going to give you what information they have. They might be on their own emissions journey. So it's there's a little bit more room for error, but as long as we have this comparable methodology and you can stand behind the methodology, say you use the greenhouse gas protocol, show your work. Kind of back to that primary school maths example, like you always want to be able to show your work. How did you get there? And the greenhouse gas protocol really helps us do that. As Donal said earlier, it is completely embedded into our platform. It's embedded into any emissions calculation work we do with businesses we work with. And yeah, kind of from my point of view, it is the simplest way to do it. Carbon accounting can be tricky, but having that kind of cookbook manual of the greenhouse gas protocol, particularly for scope 3, is, really, really great. I think we were starting to touch on some challenges that we see around scope 3, particularly with the fact that they are indirect emissions, so they're less in your specific business's control. But Donal, I'd love to hear from you, specifically from business owners. What are you hearing in terms of their biggest challenges around scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, great. Well, look, as you know, Erin, I talk to businesses a lot before they get the chance to start working with you. So I'm hearing about all of the challenges, all of their issues firsthand, and then we figure out how we can work with them best. So a lot of the things that come up, especially around emissions, is that scope 3. And it's the knowledge. You explained what it is there. A lot of people don't know what scope 3 is. It's a huge subject. And a lot of the time it's having that in-house knowledge or expertise around to navigate what that information is. That often is a huge, huge challenge. You mentioned they're indirect, but a lot of the time that makes them intangible. So, they're, well, not as tangible as getting your bill. You can upload your data and you know what that is in terms of your own energy or gas usage. So it's around getting that data, knowing where it is, and then actually how to calculate the emissions. It's so difficult for businesses. Who's going to work with that on your team? Is it the business owner? Is it the marketing manager, the sales manager, or whoever the sustainability champion within the business is? Who's going to work on it? Who's going to do the mapping and then get the data? So that's another layer of challenges. For us, we talk about mapping and doing that system mapping and looking at where your impacts are, who's got the data that you need. So once you've done that, then it's getting processes in place to gather all of that data. So there's many different layers to the trickiness and the challenges. For us, it's really about breaking it down for them, helping them map it out, and overcome those challenges. But I think they're the key issues that business owners face and business and sustainability teams within businesses face.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of those things make a lot of sense to me, even from the scientific standpoint of calculating scope 3 emissions. It's hard. Yeah, you have to get the information, and the more primary information you can get from your great relationships with your suppliers and with your partners, the better. But I want to take some time to break down these challenges and dive into them a little bit more. So in terms of the knowledge gap itself, that is incredibly understandable. Donal, we know that businesses are doing 1,000,005 different things, so it's hard to dedicate the time to really get into the nitty-gritty of what scope 3 emissions are. That's definitely where we come in. That's where resources like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol come in, or the Science-Based Targets Initiative is another great place to get started, another great place to look. They're also internationally recognized. You can set targets for a reduction based on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So those two things go hand in hand very well as well. So in terms of, that knowledge gap, ask questions of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Those are definitely your great places to start.
Yeah, agreed. And then look, just going back to that point around mapping, as a simple exercise, and you can do this with your team, and it's actually a great way to bring departments together, to bring teams together, and look at, map out the journey that your product takes from raw ingredient or from that initial material through the chain, where it lands on your door, and then where, who has responsibility for the product at different stages, who are your key suppliers. And even just making that list can often just help structure things. Then you can help prioritize, okay, who are bigger suppliers that we can start maybe approaching first to start getting this information. And, you've done this with a lot of our customers, that mapping, and it's actually a good way for businesses to identify their processes and make other efficiencies that are, go in tandem with this.
Yeah, totally. You actually read my mind. I was going to say the mapping exercise is so great for so many different things. I am 100% sure we've talked about it on a podcast before this, because it's so useful across the board, whether it's for scope 3 emissions, scope 1 and 2 emissions, energy use, waste, whatever it might be. Doing this mapping activity is going to give you multiple different benefits. It's hugely helpful, as Donal started to touch on, for information gathering. You'll know you need to get the information from. Start with the high impact partners or the partners that you already have open dialogue with. Tell them why you're asking them about this. Talk about your journey. What do you need from them? How can you collaborate potentially? What are they working on? Start it just as a conversation. And then using that map, you can kind of start to fill in the blanks and fill in the little pieces of information as you get them. And you'll be surprised how quickly it all kind of comes together. You'll learn a lot along the way, and you'll be able to put in place processes, again, as Donal mentioned, to then get this information on a regular basis to see your progress and to see how emissions change over time, whether as you grow or you put in place emissions reductions methods.
Yeah. And I suppose that's a really good first step. But when we look at businesses at tackling this, as a whole, it can be quite tricky. So you're looking at mapping out your organization or your supply chain and looking where your emissions are. Then you're looking at getting someone responsible in your team to contact your suppliers or look through that supply chain, gather data. Then you have to get the accurate data. It's really, really tricky.
Yeah.
I think for businesses getting accurate data, they can be worried sometimes about sharing it, getting it all together in the right place. And, greenwashing, we've spoken about it before. Businesses are, scared sometimes to communicate sustainability. And out of all of your sustainability activity, this can be a really hard one to quantify. And we talked about how it's not so tangible. And then to communicate it effectively can be quite tough. So yeah, I think, when we look at that, would you have any thoughts on that, Erin, or any ways to elude their fears?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as with any sustainability communications, transparency and being able to explain your methodology is key. Where did you
Mm-hmm.
get this number? If you're making any assumptions or using any estimations, why? Where did they come from? Why can't you get maybe a primary piece of information? There's always going to be room for error in these estimations, particularly in scope 3, because of how tricky it is. Just talk about what that margin of error might be. Talk about, okay, you know what? From supplier A, we weren't able to get a number from them because they're not responding or because they haven't done their own calculations yet. Like, whatever that might be, share the reason, share what maybe proxy number or estimation you used, or even if you've had to leave it out of the calculations altogether for the moment, that's okay. Just let them know. It's always going to come back to, how did you
Yeah.
calculate it? Where did your numbers come from? Explain any changes or assumptions that you made. If you're communicating internally with people who might be working on it with you, you don't have to be as in depth there, but always be ready to explain your methodology and explain any estimations or changes that you've had to make.
Yeah, Aaron, just 2 points there. I think it's worth looping back to. So businesses are looking at getting all this data, talking to suppliers. There's two other options then, or there's one or I suppose you get the data or you don't. What happens if you don't? And I think from there you mentioned two areas. One is including an estimation, or else two, you don't include the data at all. So I know we talked about this previously offline. Industry benchmarks, and although they're not ideal, sometimes it can be a substitute for the data that you just simply can't get or you're in the process of getting.
Yeah, look, I mean, as with anything, primary data, the exact numbers, that is the gold standard. That is what you should be aiming for, particularly if you are reporting this publicly or looking to communicate it publicly. However, if you are looking to maybe gather a number pretty quickly to be able to have an overall baseline to start taking action, or if you have a customer who is requesting this information of you, you might need to do a little bit quickly. We all know sometimes emails get lost. People might not get back to you quickly with the information, or they might not have it. So the other
Yeah.
options, as Donal said, there are some industry averages available through like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from the UN, the IPCC. Their database is a little bit tricky, but they might have some in there. There might be other research within your sector, whether it's from a kind of sector governing body, like if you have kind of a Society of Professional Engineers or something like that, they might have estimations. Or another way you can estimate is if it's a company that's fairly similar to yours or fairly similar to another one of your suppliers, you can use your emissions or that similar supplier's emissions as a kind of proxy estimate. But again, be really clear about where these estimates and things came from. Have the source, have like a little footnote, a little paragraph explaining it. And then when all else fails, or if you don't feel confident in the estimate or you don't feel like it's really representing it very well, leave it out for the moment, make a note, talk about how significant that chunk that's left out might be. If it's your top supplier and you buy 80% of your stuff from them, but you don't have the numbers yet, that's a pretty significant thing to leave out. So you're going to want to say, hey, this number is going to change significantly when we are able to estimate this. But if it's a supplier, let's say you get 5% of your stuff from, that's not as significant. Still important to understand, of course, because we want as much information as possible to be able to make informed decisions and take action. But the footnote won't have to be as as emphatic that, hey, this is going to change a lot when we get this information, if that makes sense. Yes. Yeah, Donal, I think that covered your question, and I'm really glad you brought that up. So I was thinking it when I was talking about the communication. I was like, oh, we'll talk about some of the proxies that are out there as well. So that's great.
Yeah, so I think in that communication, transparency, we're not making wild guesstimates as well. So if you do have to leave it, it's probably better to leave a figure out if you're not sure or if you don't have any real data to go on, and leave that note to say, look, we're aware of this, we're working on it, and we'll add it as we get some real reliable data. So I think that's a really good point. Erin, there's a lot there. We're never going to unpack the entirety of Scope 3 in a short podcast. In the spirit of time and practicality, like we always do, can you give our listeners and viewers 3 top tips for getting started with Scope 3? And, with a view that, yes, there's a lot more work to do, but what are your 3 top tips for getting started?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to that organizational map. Make your organizational map from your internal operations, because then you can also use it for your Scope 1 and 2, and include your upstream and downstream value chain. Be as detailed as you can. Imagine you're the product, or you're the service, or you're the customer. How would you move through that value chain? And you want to have every stop on that map. Once you have that, start the communication with the businesses you need information from early. Start it by saying, hey, we're on our own sustainability journey. Share what you can. Don't just jump right in with a huge information request. Foster that conversation. Start asking them early, because then you'll be more likely to get the data when you need it in a format that is usable for you. And then last but not least, take it one category at a time. Use your organizational map and those 15 categories from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to figure out which categories are the most relevant to you. Start with those, and then start adding them on like building blocks as you get more and more comfortable and you get farther and farther on your Scope 3 journey.
Brilliant, Erin. Thanks for that. And hopefully that gives people confidence that Scope 3 is actually manageable, and we can start. We can get started as part of our sustainability journey. So thank you, Erin. From myself, I suppose, after listening to all that and chatting that through with you, I think a lot of businesses we work with, their SMEs and Scope 1 and 2 is probably more relevant for them right now. And that's in terms of the data requests that they're getting, and, for answering tenders, and for just, for probably their own in-house resources for managing all of this. And that Scope 1 and 2 is more relevant, but that does not mean they need to forget about Scope 3. So, our advice is definitely, let's start mapping that out, start getting a handle on it. And it's really advantageous for you as a business to start looking at Scope 3 now, piece by piece, as opposed to looking at it in one big chunk when you're asked for the information. And that may come in the future through reporting, or reporting requirements may expand for you to start looking at Scope 3. So that would definitely be my top tip, Erin, as well, to just get started on it. And it doesn't all have to be done at once right now.
Yeah, completely agree with you. Huge business benefits to taking a look at it, but also on top of that, it is most likely the majority of your carbon footprint. So from a climate action standpoint, it's hugely important to take a look at, and it allows for some really interesting potential collaborations across your value chain. So you never know what comes of those conversations as well. Yeah,
great point, Erin. Yeah, when you say it is 90% plus of your emissions, in terms of impact, we do need to look at it as a business community. So fantastic. So feel free to visit the ENSO website. There's lots of tools, resources and guides on Scope 3, your emissions, and your sustainability journey. So that's ensoimpact.com.
And don't forget to follow along with the podcast for more updates and tips. We're here to help every step of the way. I'm actually very excited about our next episode. We're going to kind of culminate our emissions trio of episodes with some practical actions to get started with emissions reduction. Our last episode and this episode, we're really just diving into measuring and understanding your Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. But yeah, we're ready to jump into some actual reduction actions next time. So make sure you tune in, and thank you so much.